So Daniel has these first two qualities that I think God is raising up within the body of Christ. First, we're developing radical compassion for wicked kings, where Daniel literally had a love for this guy. And then he lives with a no compromise attitude to the word of the Lord. When God gave him a hard word, he literally could stand before the most powerful ruler on earth and deliver it with authority. But there was a heart of compassion behind it, and it literally had the ability to shake the course of history. All right. The next part, if you have a Bible or you want to turn your iPhone to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9, I want to point out the prayer of Daniel. Daniel is reading in Daniel chapter 9, starting verse 1 and 2. He's reading the word of the Lord that God gave to Jeremiah. And when Daniel starts reading Jeremiah's prophecy, keep in mind, they're alive at around the same time. So even though Daniel knows Isaiah by heart, he would have known some of the other prophets by heart, he knew everything that came before by heart, he's just learning Jeremiah, right? And so he's reading Jeremiah, and he reads about how God is going to allow Babylon to bring them into captivity, and that captivity is going to last 70 years. Daniel now gets a revelation. I'm in the middle of this. We are actually living out what this prophet said would happen. Now here's the thing. Daniel doesn't have a whatever attitude. God's in the middle of this. He's doing this, so we don't have to worry about any of this. Daniel spends Daniel chapter 9 realizing he's in the middle of the word of the Lord, but this is what he does. He prays into it. He prays into it, and he asks God to actually change his mind about some things.
Nice.
See, friends of God can do this. Moses comes to God one day and goes, hey, God says, stand back, Moses. I'm going to destroy all these people that you brought out of Egypt. And Moses goes, time out. They're not my people. They're your people. I didn't bring them out of Egypt. You did. And if you destroy them, what are the rest of the nations going to say? Their God's not strong enough to bring them into the land of promise? And God goes, you're right.
Yeah, you're right.
What?
Good old-fashioned King James Bible, let this just discomfort you a little bit. Good old-fashioned King James Bible literally says God repented.
Right.
I don't even know what you wanted. It just means he changed his mind. What happened? God was looking for somebody he could commune with. And I don't think God was moving in reverse psychology here, but I do think he was stirring something in Moses' heart that matched his own for his people.
Wow.
So God will take you through a process of learning his heart. It'd be so much easier if he just kind of snap his fingers and suddenly your heart is filled with love for people. But that's not the way it works. He takes you through a process where it's difficult to love. And when you overcome those obstacles, when you overcome those hurdles toward loving, then suddenly you start realizing that love goes deeper. It gets weathered, right? But it's real and it's strong. As we mentioned the other day, God comes to Hosea one day and says, go marry a prostitute. She's not going to quit her night job. You're going, why would you do that? If I'm a pastor and somebody comes to me and says, God told me to do this, I'd be like, yeah, that don't sound like God. But it was for one guy, for one season. Why? Because God wanted this guy to speak what was on his heart, but he wanted him to speak it with the right attitude. So he takes him through a multi-year process where he finally gets to the end of the process, buys his own wife back from the auction. And when he does, he says, you're never going out again. And now he realizes she knows how loved she is. But here's the deal. From this point on, Hosea prophesies from a different place. And he gives what I think is the greatest end-time prophecy that we haven't seen come to pass yet. And this is what he says in the last part of Hosea chapter 2 and the first part of Hosea chapter 3. He says, in the last days, I will pour out, speaking from God, I will pour out compassion on those who have not earned it.
Nice.
And I will say to those people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. And a nation will come trembling to the Lord and his goodness in the last days. There's an end time word for you.
Amen.
That is the goodness of God will so be on display that it will make people go weak in the knees and want to get closer.
Praise God.
There's the last day's message I don't think I've ever heard anybody else preach. How did Hosea get there? God took him through a process, many years, of becoming a person understanding his heart. God's still creating you, by the way. He's still forming you. You're finished. You're product of the finished work of the cross. But you are just beginning to understand what that even means for you.
Right.
God may be working out in you the process of learning how to have compassion for wicked kings, how to literally walk without compromise to the word of the Lord. Jeremiah had said this 70 years thing. Daniel sees it and he prays into it. And he gets to this part in verse 17 where he says, "O Lord," he says, "let your face shine on us. Let your face shine on your desolate sanctuary. God, incline your ear and hear. Open your eyes and see our desolations, the city called by your name. We're not presenting our supplications before you on account of any merits of our own, but on account of your great compassion." So here's the deal. The word supplication is really an important word because it literally means to ask for grace that you don't deserve. To realize, I don't deserve this grace, but I'm going to ask for it anyway. And this is what Daniel does. He says here in verse 19, he says, "O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and take action." In other words, do something now. So even though they're in the middle of the will of God, Daniel literally prays into it and asks God to change his mind about some things and give them grace. Now, verse 20, something amazing happens. Daniel says, while I was doing 5 things, while I was speaking, while I was praying, while I was confessing my sin, because he does that a lot in chapter 9, and he says, and while I was confessing the sin of my people and presenting my supplication. This is how he ends the prayer, by asking for grace. He says, suddenly the angel Gabriel shows up to me. He shows up, and Gabriel says in verse 22, he says, "Daniel, I've come forth to give you insight and understanding. At the beginning of your supplication, the command was issued." This is an important part of this story. Daniel does 5 things in this story. He's talking to God. He's praying to God. He's confessing his sin. He's confessing the sin of his people. There's precedent for all of that, but none of that moved the hand of God. The angel comes to him and says, when you started making supplication, the command was issued, as if God was leaning forward on the throne, listening to every word Daniel says. He's praying, he's confessing his sin, he's confessing the sin of his people. He just asked for grace. Go.
Nice.
And this is the third thing. Ask God for grace for yourself and for your nation. It is legal to ask God for grace. Not just for you, but for people who don't deserve it. From your standpoint and theirs, it is okay to ask God for grace for somebody else. It's as if God was like, all that other stuff is fine, but here's the thing that pulls the trigger, that moves my heart. When you're actually willing to ask me for grace for others. Ask God for grace. The next part comes in Daniel chapter 10. Daniel chapter 10 and verse 12. Daniel has the most radical encounter with God in all of his 5 encounters. And it's amazing. It leaves Daniel and all of his friends just rocked, by the way. And there's all these people around him, and they all get absolutely just freaked out, terrified. And Daniel finds himself trembling on the ground. In chapter 10 and verse 12, an angel comes to Daniel and basically tells him why he's having all of these experiences and gives him what I believe is 2 major keys to answered prayer, which I think we're all interested in. Chapter 10 and verse 12, the angel says to Daniel, Daniel stands up trembling, and he says to Daniel, do not be afraid. Don't be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart to understand. That's the next part. Daniel lived a life postured toward understanding. I want you to catch this. When you get to the point where you have radical compassion for wicked kings, not for the purpose of this, but God will actually start increasing favor upon your life and influence upon your life. It's an interesting thing. Nowadays, I go to young people and I ask them, what do you want to be? What do you want to be when you grow up? They give me a word that I never said when I was in school. I didn't even know this word. I wouldn't have ever come up with this word in a million years. But the number one thing the next generation wants to be is an influencer. Isn't that fascinating? An influencer. I'm saying if you want to be an influencer, look at this guy's life. Because walking in radical compassion toward wicked kings, living without compromise to the word of the Lord, and asking grace for his nation, literally postured Daniel all the days of his life to carry tremendous influence to the point where he became number 2 in the land in power and in authority. Now you would think if you got that much power, that much wealth, and that much authority, nobody can tell you anything. But Daniel remains a student. He stays a student all the days of his life. One of the most important words of the Lord that ever came to me was, I had a dear friend years ago that invited me to go hear a minister I'd never heard of named Bill Johnson. And a long time ago, in 2006, never forget this. And he says, this guy's coming to town. He's got this conference going on. And his name's Bill Johnson. I said, that's a dull-sounding name. So I've never heard of him. If I've never heard of him, he must not be that great. And so I said, I don't know, I'm kind of conferenced out, not really interested in going. And he goes, oh, well, if you change your mind, let me know. That was on a Thursday. Bill was speaking on a Friday. And that night, I woke myself up in the middle of the night, and I was face down in my pillow, and I was saying out loud this phrase, which this has never happened to me before or since. But I heard myself say out loud, what you know will keep you from what you need to know if you don't remain a novice. I don't use the word novice, so I thought it was weird. What you know will keep you from what you need to know if you don't remain a novice. Wow. So I reached over and I wrote it down on posted by my nightstand, and I fell back asleep. I woke up the next morning, I looked at it, and I thought, what a strange phrase. And suddenly I had this realization that I needed to go to this meeting. I didn't think the two were connected at all. I showed up late to the meeting, and I walked in, and there was no seats left. And I stood up against the back wall, and with a bunch of other people that were standing up against the back wall. And Bill was up speaking, and he said 3 things I'll never forget. First thing he says, he looks out, and he says, Jesus Christ is the most normal Christian in the Bible. And I'm thinking, I'm a Christian. I think I'm relatively normal. I'm nothing like Jesus. Huh. How offensive. It was weird. One statement, so much truth on it, but it offended me. It kind of shook me a little. And then, long pause, Bill goes, Jesus Christ is perfect theology. Well, I went to Bible college. I was a theology major. I spent a lot of money. Nobody told me be like Jesus because he is perfect theology. I thought Jesus was an unattainable standard. So now that second phrase offends me. So I'm thinking to myself, if somebody would have just told me those 2 things, it would have saved me years of time and money. And he scans the room, just looks around like this, and then he looks at the back of the room and looks straight at me, kind of tilts his head like this and goes, what you know will keep you from what you need to know if you don't remain a novice. And I went, years later, I told him about that, and he laughed and laughed. That was funny.
Love me some Bill.
I realized the value of staying teachable, never becoming an expert in any of this stuff. Discovering that, like I like to say, when I come into the presence of the Lord, when I come to an awareness of the presence of the Lord, I want God to answer all my questions. This is not what God does. He questions all my answers. It's almost like he goes, I'll answer your questions, Bill. Oh, by the way, here's some more questions. And so I always kind of like walk out of those experiences with more questions than I started with. I have answers, but now I have more questions. So I was like telling people, I wish you guys had met me 20 years ago when I knew so much more than I know now. Because isn't it true? The longer you walk with God, the more the kingdom expands, and the more you become comfortable with the phrase, I don't know. I don't really know. Why does this happen? What's going on here? How come this didn't take place? Yeah, I don't know. The kingdom of God, we grow into childlikeness. We mature into childlikeness. But what do children do? They ask why all the time. Stay teachable. Stay teachable. And this is Daniel. And the angel comes to him and says, from the moment that you set your heart to understand, and the last one, he said, and you set yourself to walk humble before God. This is what the angel says to Daniel, and this describes Daniel's lifestyle. This is Daniel's final encounter, his final word that he's going to get in his life. We don't hear from Daniel after this word. He says, from the moment you set your heart to understand and walk humbly before God, your prayer was heard. Your words were heard. And think about that. I think every one of us in this room is interested in answered prayer. Every one of us. All of us want our prayers to be heard. I want you to see, this is a messenger from heaven literally telling Daniel two things that caught the attention of heaven. And that is that you set your heart to understand and walk humbly before God. What does it mean to walk humbly before God? I think when we think of humility, we think of, I think of it like this. Back in the day, when I won't tell you what denomination I was a part of, but when I was a denominational pastor, back in the day, I found great pleasure in exalting my depravity and sinfulness. And if any of you grew up in that denomination, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's almost like a spiritual sadomasochism. In other words, it's not kind of a crude topic, but here we are. It's like this. It's like we get together and we would do these conferences like on Job and on suffering and stuff, and then we would like talk about how worthless we all were. And on one hand, it felt super humble. On the other hand, internally, it kind of felt good. And you realized it was actually a pride disguised as humility. We were proud about how worthless we were. And if somebody got up and talked about how good God is and how his righteousness has become our identity, we would have been like, whoa, red flags everywhere, pride, arrogance. And it's like we didn't know the difference between arrogance and confidence. We looked at everybody who was confident in the finished work of the cross, we called them arrogant, we wrote them off. And when God started encountering me with his goodness, by the way, this is the way we stayed humble. We took God at his holiness and we pushed him away, and us in our worthlessness, we cowered in his presence. It was a king to a peasant relationship. And then God shows up and says, no, this is a father to a son relationship, right? Not only that, but my plan is not to harm you. It's for your good, all right? I'm here to bless you with an identity of the righteousness that actually belongs to me. What about my sinfulness? He who knew no sin became sin for us so that we might be the righteousness of God in him. He says, I'm going to become sin for you. You're going to become righteousness. And that's just who you are. Okay? By my holiness, by my righteousness, you're in. All right? And once I rested in the reality of that, suddenly I came to this new covenant, brilliant new covenant revelation. And that is this, that I can literally walk in humble intimacy with God. I look at the gift of his righteousness and I realize I don't deserve this, but his holiness has now become my identity, and it has nothing to do with my behavior. You are holy, and it's not even your fault. I've been brought into union with his holiness and his righteousness, and it's not even anything of my doing. And so there's this thing where it's like humility doesn't have to produce a posture of separation for you to walk in humility before a holy God. You can actually, under the new covenant, humility and intimacy don't work against each other. They actually go together. I can walk in intimacy and communion, common union with God, without him ever becoming so familiar that it breeds contempt in my heart. You know, the angels that go around the throne, Isaiah chapter 6, go around the throne that say, holy, 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 holy. You know, it looks kind of boring. It's like that's what they're doing for all eternity. They're just flying around the throne going, holy, holy, holy. And I'm thinking, yeah, 10 minutes of that, and I'd probably be like, you know. But here's what they're doing. Every aspect, every change, every blink of the eye, every movement shows a new aspect of his holiness that they've never seen before. So it's kind of like they're going around the throne going, holy, holy, holy. It's like eternally shocked with joy at like this sense of like, why would I want to do anything else? Just look at this. It'll take me all of eternity to see the holiness of God. Why is that amazing? Because every revelation about him gives you a revelation about something about you. That's why beholding him is such a big deal. As we behold him, we're transformed and we're changed. And the more that I see him, the more that I see his holiness and righteousness, the more I'm filled with the thanksgiving and gratitude that becomes the posture of my heart, because I didn't do any of this. I'm not responsible for my holiness. Now I can walk in a humble intimacy with God. And actually, it doesn't war against my union with him. I can literally live in union with a holy God in spite of all of the reasons I could say, well, I don't deserve that. Thanks for grace. So here's the deal. Here's the deal. Radical compassion for wicked kings. No compromise to the word of the Lord. Asking for grace for yourself and your nation. Setting your heart toward understanding. Staying teachable. And walking humbly before a holy God. Holiness and intimacy working together. These things, I think God is arising a Daniel company among us. You say, what is the big deal about this? How does this even work? What was the end result of this? I want you to go back to the very first point. Where he walks in radical compassion toward wicked kings and wicked people. The lives that Daniel saved. If you're a spiritual seeker of spiritual power, and you realize I don't have the ability, no demon, no false god that I serve can give me a dream and the interpretation, but this guy got it. If you're a spiritual seeker of spiritual power, what do? You drop everything you believed and you go to that guy and you say, first off, thanks for saving my life. Second, teach me what you know. Daniel instantly has disciples. Instantly. Now Daniel's got a company of people that are coming around him, learning from him. He's got influence. He is second in power in the entire nation. All of the magicians and astrologers and wise men are now students of Daniel's. By Daniel chapter 10, when you see Daniel having an encounter with this angel, there's a whole bunch of other people that are with him during this encounter that are absolutely terrified as well. Who are these people? These are the wise men. These are the magicians. These are the astrologers that actually follow Daniel around. Now, if you're this, by the way, anybody know what happened to Daniel, where he died? He died in a city called Susa or Shush. It's one or the other. Both names are actually applicable. It's a city that Esther lived in. It's over in Iran, and it's really, really hard to get to. And this is extra biblical information, but if you go over there, you can actually go to the shrine of Daniel. They built a shrine to him. But they didn't bury Daniel when he died. They didn't bury him for 3 centuries, because for 300 years his body didn't decay. They put him in a bed, and they would carry his body wherever they needed rain. If they needed rain over in this part of the country, they'd bring Daniel over there. Rain would fall. This is Muslim tradition now, by the way. Now, you're saying, why would you believe anything the Muslims say? They have no reason to lie about a guy who was a servant of Jehovah, right? But this is the traditions that they carry. Daniel's body literally never decayed. They actually put him in a coffin, and eventually they started, because it's easier to transport if they put him in a box, and they put him in this coffin, and they transport him back and forth across this river until these two factions of people started fighting over the body. Around 1100 AD, this is like 1400 years after the guy dies, finally a king goes, wrap that thing in chains and dump it in the middle of the river. I'm tired of you guys fighting over the body. Maybe if you put it in the middle of the river, rain will fall on both sides and you guys can like each other again. And that's exactly what they did. They put him in a sarcophagus that has on it, it has 2 lions and a man standing in the middle, and dropped it right in the middle of this fast-moving river where his body is to this day. And they built a shrine up on the bank of the river, and people from all over the place would come and visit it up until 1979. Nowadays, getting there is almost impossible. But here's what they'll tell you if you go there. They'll say that Daniel had influence in that country that lasts to this day. And here's the most notable evidence of that influence. 400 years after Daniel's life, in Bethlehem, Jesus is born. There's prophecies about the Messiah. Isaiah tells you how he's going to be born. Micah tells you where he's going to be born. Daniel actually talked about when he was going to be born. And so you put those things together and you realize, oh, they have a recipe for the coming of the Messiah. What would Daniel have passed down to them? The words of the Lord that have been spoken by the prophets. And this discipleship program of Daniel's appears to last not just a generation or two, but it lasts for 4 centuries. To the point where Daniel's, or the Jews in Bethlehem, in Judea, in Jerusalem at the time, totally missed the coming of the Messiah. But you know who figured it out? Wise men. They're called magi, from where we get the term magician, from the east in the direction of what had been Babylon. What were they doing? They're descendants of the magi, the wise men, the astrologers. You know what they followed to find Jesus? They followed the stars. We'd say there were 3 wise men because it was gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But each one needed to carry like one gift. I mean, there's no record that there was 3. I mean, there was probably way more than that. These guys had spent generations, centuries waiting for this moment, looking, watching, remembering. How would they have even known the word of the Lord? Somebody had to tell them what the prophets had spoken and given them such a priority of, listen, if you guys want the biggest thing in all big things, it's the coming of the Messiah. And this is where he's coming. This is how he's coming. This is when he's coming. Keep your eyes on the sky and watch. God's going to put a sign in the heavens for you. Think about it. I'm super happy as a youth pastor that half the youth group isn't in jail, right? I was a youth pastor for like 6 years. I'm glad that most of them are out of jail now, right? I'm like, if my disciples last for a generation, I'll be feeling like a success. Daniel had such influence through this. The power of Daniel's influence lasted at least 400 years. Wow. Why does it matter that you listen to the word of the Lord? Because God wants you to have the kind of influence that lasts for centuries. Yeah. Generational influence, multi-generational discipleship. It's the magi that come across the desert carrying what Bible scholars say is the equivalent of $12 million worth of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they are so sure that what they have seen and waited for is real. They're not deterred at all by when they finally end up at a stable with a young couple, young girl who looks way too young to be married, and a baby laying in a feeding trough. What do? They take all that money, all that wealth, they bow down, worship, and give an offering. Even Jesus' own countrymen missed it, but Daniel's disciples didn't. That's the power of multi-generational influence. That's the power of living in no compromise to the word of the Lord, radical compassion toward wicked kings, setting your heart to understand, praying for grace for yourself and your nation, even in the middle of the will of God, and walking humbly before your God. This is the power of that moment. What's that $12 million end up doing? It ends up funding this little family leaving the nation and fleeing to Egypt where Jesus could grow up in safety, where he wouldn't be threatened. So here's the beauty of this whole thing. Daniel was willing, listen to this, to overlook the burning down and destruction of the temple of stone, because prophetically he could see into the future that his obedience to the word of the Lord would prepare for the coming of the incarnate temple of flesh in Christ into the earth. That was Daniel's posture. And I'm sitting here looking today, and I'm looking around going, okay, we look at our nation, and the slightest move to where it looks like that something evil is happening, we freak out. Right. We immediately freak out, and we end up sacrificing our influence on the altar of what we think is right. And what I'm saying is this: there will be a time to stand up and fight for the values of the kingdom of God, but don't do a single thing unless God says do it. Yeah.
Right. That's right.
This is a big deal. And how many of you know that in Daniel's lifetime, to his own people, he probably looked like he was walking in compromise? Yep. Don't you wonder, like, the children of Israel are sitting there looking at Daniel going, you have access to the king, man. Why are you being so kind to these guys? Daniel outlives multiple kings. King Darius, right? King Darius is a crazy guy who makes an unbreakable decree. If you pray to any other god than our gods, our Persian gods, we're going to throw you in the lion's den. Somebody says, Daniel's praying to another god. Darius says, it's unbreakable. Got to throw this guy in the den. I really liked him, though. Throws Daniel in the lion's den. The next day, Darius can't sleep, he can't eat. He gets up and he runs to the den. He looks in the den and goes, Daniel, was your God able to save you? I would have gone, I don't know, why don't you come down here and find out? We're not friends anymore. That was a deal breaker, man. I mean, what does Daniel say? Wakes up. Oh, King, live forever. My God. That's what he says. Oh, King, may you live forever. My God has shut the lion's mouth. Darius is like, new decree. The guys who threw you in the pit, they're going in now. And the lions tear them apart before they even hit the ground. Daniel crawls out of the pit. Not a scratch. Slept warm all night. Life is good. Even Darius goes, this guy worships the true God. What is Daniel doing? He's not letting anything create an offense in his heart.
Wow.
That will overcome his compassion. I'll tell you one story and then we'll call it a day. You guys know Joe Biden. I'm sure you do. Better than anybody, I think. In 2016, I went there, sorry. In 2016, is it 2016? It's a year that Trump won. I was in Waterville, Maine, and I was walking by Colby College. I was doing a conference up there, and it was on a Saturday afternoon. And I'm walking by Colby College there, and at the end of one of the buildings, the door opens, and Joe Biden comes walking out. Really weird. And he's with a Secret Service guy, and they come walking out, and they're looking around like this. And I looked and went, Joe Biden? Not Mr. Vice President, Joe Biden? And he looks at me and sticks his hand out and goes, who'd you vote for? There we are. And so he says, what did you say? He says, we had a really simple conversation for about 2 minutes, and he just says, I'm here doing the commencement address, and we were supposed to have a driver. We were supposed to go to the airport, and they went to the wrong entrance, so we got to wait here for them to come around. So we had about 2 minutes to talk. And it was a real surface conversation, but you know how you're having conversations with people, and at the same time you're listening for the word of the Lord? So I'm having one of these moments, and I'm just hearing the Lord just say, watch. And in my mind, I'm thinking, why does this matter? This feels really important, but why does this matter? This guy's like an ex-vice president. He has no future in politics. And I felt the Lord say, I want you to, when I left him, pretty soon here comes the driver. We took a quick video picture, and that was it. Nothing I intended to ever show to anybody. No event I ever intended to talk about. And I got in my car, and I was driving back to the conference to do the afternoon session. And I felt like the Lord said, I want you to dedicate yourself to pray for Joe. And I said out loud, why? And why? Like, I know he's a guy, he's a human being, he's man made in your image and likeness, so it matters, but why? And I felt like the Lord said back to me, because nobody else is.
Wow.
Come on, dude.
Yep.
And it broke my heart. I immediately had this overwhelming sense that this is an assignment to pray for this guy. So for 4 years, I prayed for Joe Biden. Without any sense of why. Just to pray. I get up in the morning and I'd be praying, I'd be like, God bless Uncle Joe. Minister to him, touch his heart. Bless his life, give him an encounter with you. Bless his family and his health. It's weird. Praying for this guy like I know him. I don't. 2-minute conversation, I'm stuck praying for this guy for 4 years. When he decided to run, I knew in my heart why. I knew. I realized in that moment, you set me up. You set me up.
It's your fault.
Haven't met him anymore. We haven't haven't gotten together. We don't hang out on the weekends.
I can tell you where his house is.
But I will say that.
You're here, you could.
Yeah, I know his address, yeah. But I knew, God, what's the point? I still don't fully understand. I still don't, but
October when I woke up from that dream.
But I can tell you that what God had stirred within me was a 4-year process that I wouldn't have the heart to receive this message, except that I dedicated myself to pray for somebody who, by all intents and purposes, by value in politics, would be my enemy. Then I read the words of Jesus. I'm not just supposed to pray for my enemies. Oh my goodness. Love your enemies. That's what Daniel did. Bless those who curse you. That's what Daniel did. Pray for those who despitefully use you. That's exactly what Daniel did. And I realized God is raising up, I think in this day, a Daniel company of people who walk in radical compassion, even towards wicked people, understanding that the influence that you build during those moments will actually give you multi-generational discipleship power to actually see into the future what God's purposes and intention are for the days ahead. And you have the authority to speak beyond the lifespan of your own voice. Amen. And I realized there's something about this that God is bringing into us. But I looked at it throughout this week and I thought, what would happen if we applied this to our marriage? So many times we get offended when our spouse suddenly becomes our enemy. The reality is nobody can be your enemy without your permission. We live in radical compassion toward them, not because they live in compassion toward us or love. We do that because that's just what God puts in our heart to do. We live in radical compassion towards them. We live in no compromise to the word of the Lord. That means that whatever God speaks to you to tell your spouse, you do so from a foundation of love. And listen, some days, catch this with me, some days you might be walking in such a way that your spouse gets a word from God that's hard for you. Keep your love on and watch what happens when you deliver a word speaking the truth in love. Doesn't guarantee that they'll respond rightly, but you're the person that has to be the one, the tip of the spear that actually speaks into their life. This girl can speak into my life in ways nobody else can. And she has. And when she does, I sit there and go, I know this comes from a heart of love. And what do? I respond and I surrender to it. It shapes my perspective. It shapes my life. That word begins to shape me from the inside out. I know that she walks in radical love toward me, even when I've been wicked. I know that she walks in no compromise to the word of the Lord because she's given me words not out of wrath, but out of a passionate, consuming fire of a heart of love that reflects God. It melts and shapes and changes me. This is something we got to do in our own homes. Asking for grace, not just for yourself, but for your spouse and your kids. It's legal to ask for grace for somebody else. Do it. And then setting your heart to understand, to always put yourself in a position of being teachable and giving them permission to actually teach you something you didn't know. And finally, walk in humility. And that is to be in awe. I mean, I am in awe of this girl, and yet it doesn't hinder our intimacy at all. I'd say if we just begin to apply these things in our own home, God will begin to start giving us influence outside of the walls of our own family. Does that make sense? Awesome. Stand with me this morning. Well, that was like a 10.